So the Black-Scholes assumptions about the stock return, and that is, as I mentioned previously, that the returns are normally distributed. I mentioned in the last chapter that the binomial distribution of returns underlying the binomial lattice is an approximation to the normal distribution of returns. And in Black-Scholes, the normal distribution of returns is explicitly assumed, that R is normally distributed. Consequently, if the returns are normally distributed, by definition, stock prices are log normally distributed. So this is the model that the binomial distribution converges to as the time steps increase. It also assumes that the volatility is known and constant. Two questionable assumptions, but ones that are at least not totally unreasonable, but not always valid. It's sometimes difficult to know what volatility should be. That was discussed in an earlier module. And certainly, volatility is not constant. One can look at graphs of volatility of many, many risky assets and find that periods of high and low volatility exist. It also assumes that future dividends are known. Namely, that in order to price an option, one must either know or make an assumption about future dividends. And the reason is, the payment of dividends affects future stock prices. Future stock prices affects the value of exercise. So one cannot get away from the fact that options do require one to make assumptions about dividends if you do not know them. So it says future dividends are known. Another way of saying that is this model requires you to make an assumption about what those dividends are, and if it turns out the dividends you assumed are incorrect, it'll also turn out that the price that was calculated based on those assumed dividends will also be correct. So there is a risk in the implementation of this formula anytime one needs to speculate or make an assumption about what the dividend stream will be. But honestly, that's no different than having to make an assumption about the risk-free rate or make an assumption about future volatility. Black-Scholes also makes assumptions about the economic environment, one of which is that the risk-free rate is known and constant. Again, it's a simplifying assumption. The Black-Scholes formula can be generalized away from that assumption, but in our model here, that's what we assume. We also assume there's no transaction costs or taxes. Transactions costs and taxes on profits and losses are material in the real world. And the reason is, why is it material? Because you recall from our binomial pricing experience that we saw that the replicating portfolio needed to be changed each period in the binomial lattice. Rebalancing a replicating portfolio means transactions costs. So in the real world, when one is contemplating implementing these prices, one needs to accommodate transactions costs to the extent they exist and make adjustments for them. But in the Black-Scholes formula, we'll assume that all rebalancing can be done free. Finally, Black-Scholes assumes that we can both borrow or lend at the risk-free rate. We assume that we can do long positions and short positions in Treasury bills effectively, and that's often not a bad assumption, at least not for the institutional brokers. Institutional brokers who one can argue are a big part of the arbitrage activities in the market. These assumptions are not too violated for a retail trader or a retail investor like you or me. The notion that we have no transactions costs or that we can short sell and borrow at the risk-free rate is perhaps a little more of a stretch. But the pricing here one can think of as being fairly close to reality for institutional players for which these assumptions are closer to reality.